The Korath Nebula was a place where ships went to die, and Commander Elias Vance had made a career out of picking their bones clean. His vessel, the Defiant Wake, drifted through the purple haze of ionized gas with engines running quiet and sensors sweeping the darkness for anything worth taking. Anything that might pay for fuel, food, and another month of survival in the lawless stretches between empires. "Contact," his navigator called out, her voice cutting through the hum of the bridge. "Big one, Commander looks like a Volante cruiser. Military class, and she is not moving." Elias leaned forward in his chair and studied the holographic display that flickered to life before him. The ship was indeed Volante, all elegant curves and crystalline hull plating that caught the nebula's light like a jewel floating in poison. But something was wrong with her. No running lights, no engine signatures, no life signs broadcasting on any frequency. Volante this far out? His engineer muttered from the back of the bridge. That makes no sense. They never leave their precious borders. But Elias was already standing, already pulling on his worn jacket and checking the pistol at his hip. He had learned long ago that things that made no sense often meant profit or danger, and in his experience, they usually meant both. The boarding was quiet and eerie in ways that made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. The Defiant Wake locked onto the cruiser's emergency airlock, and Elias led a team of 4 through corridors that should have been filled with the tall, graceful forms of Volante crew members. Instead, they found only silence and the faint smell of something burnt. Then they found the bodies. Volante guards lay scattered through the halls like broken statues, their iridescent blood painting abstract patterns on the walls and ceiling. Whatever had happened here had been violent and fast. A massacre carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had no interest in taking prisoners. Slavers, Elias said quietly, recognizing the burn patterns on the walls from weapons favored by the cartels that operated in this region. They hit this ship hard. His crew wanted to turn back. This was not salvage anymore, but a crime scene. And the Volante Dominion was famous for executing first and asking questions never when it came to their dead. But Elias kept moving deeper into the ship, following some instinct he could not name. The hold was locked with security protocols that should have taken days to crack. But someone had already done most of the work. The door hung open, bent and scarred from forced entry. And inside, Elias found a room that had clearly been designed for one purpose. Only in the center sat a stasis pod, sleek and humming with power even as the rest of the ship lay dead around it. Wires and explosives had been rigged around its base in a crude butt, effective trap anyone who tried to open it without the right codes would trigger. A blast big enough to vaporize everything within 50 meters. What in the void is this? One of his crew whispered. Elias moved closer and wiped frost from the pod's viewing window. And what he saw made his heart stop for just a moment. Inside lay a young Volante female, her crystalline skin pale blue and shot through with veins of silver that marked her as something special. She had 4 slender arms folded across her chest, and a face that still held the softness of youth despite the terror frozen in her features. But it was her eyes that told him everything, even closed. He could see the faint glow beneath her lids, the mark of Volante royalty that no commoner could ever possess. "Commander," his navigator said slowly, "please tell me that is not what I think it is." "Get back to the ship," Elias said, without turning around. "All of you." "Elias, we need to leave. If she is royal blood and the Dominion finds out we were here, they will burn our ship and everyone in it. They will not care that we had nothing to do with this." But Elias was already kneeling beside the pod, already studying the wires and the explosive charges with the careful eye of a man who had disarmed worse things in worse places. "She is somebody's kid," he said simply. "Go back to the ship and keep the engines warm." His crew argued and pleaded and threatened to leave without him. But in the end they did as he asked. They always did. because they had followed Elias Vance through fire and void and the cold spaces between stars. And they knew that when he set his mind to something, no force in the galaxy could change it. 11 hours he worked on that bomb, 11 hours of tracing wires with shaking hands, of cutting connections that could have ended him in a flash of light and heat, of fighting exhaustion and fear and the constant voice in his head that asked why he was risking everything for a girl who would probably hate him simply for being human. The Volante Dominion had no love for humanity. They considered humans to be crude, violent, and barely worthy of acknowledgement, a young species that had spread too far too fast and would surely burn itself out within a few centuries. The idea that a human might save one of their princesses would be laughable to them, maybe even insulting. But Elias did not work for the Volante Dominion, and he did not care what they thought of his species when the last wire was cut and the charges were safely removed. He entered the release sequence he had pieced together from the ship's damaged computers. The pod hissed and clicked and slowly opened, releasing a cloud of cold vapor that swirled around him like ghost fingers. The girl's eyes opened. They were everything the legends said they would be. Fractured starlight, broken rainbows, galaxies compressed into two small points that fixed on his face with raw and absolute terror. She screamed and scrambled backward, pressing herself against the inside of the pod and raising all four arms in a defensive gesture that would have been threatening if she were not shaking so badly. "Easy," Elias said softly, raising his own hands to show they were empty. "Easy now. I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand him. Volante and Terran Standard shared almost no common words, but she seemed to understand his tone, his posture, the deliberate slowness of his movements. Her screaming faded to whimpers, and her shaking slowed just enough that she could focus on his face. Elias pointed to himself and said his name 3 times until she seemed to grasp it. Then he pointed to her and waited with a patience that surprised even him. It took almost an hour before she spoke, her voice rough from disuse and fear. "Thessaly," she whispered, and Elias felt the weight of that single word settle onto his shoulders like a mountain. He knew that name. Everyone in the galaxy knew that name. Thessaly Verkith, Crown Princess of the Volante Dominion, missing for 3 cycles and mourned as dead by an empire of trillions. Her face had been on every news feed, her memorial broadcast to every corner of known space, and here she was, alive and terrified and looking at him like he might be the monster that finally ended her nightmare or the miracle that saved her from it. Elias made his choice in that moment. As easily as breathing. "Thessaly," he said gently, "I am going to take you home." The Volante Dominion lay on the other side of the galaxy, and every path that led there was painted with danger. Elias spread the star charts across the table in the Chungalulas, Defiant Wake's small common room, and traced the routes with his finger while his crew watched in grim silence. There was the pirate corridor, where 100 different gangs fought over scraps and would happily tear apart any ship that crossed their territory. There was the corporate zone, where 3 megacorporations were currently engaged in a shooting war that had already claimed thousands of vessels. And there was the boundary, the edge of Volante space itself, where human ships were destroyed on sight without warning or mercy. "We could send a message," his navigator suggested without much hope. "Tell the Dominion where she is, and let them come get her. And trust that they receive it?" Elias replied, "Trust that they believe it? Trust that whoever intercepts our signal does not decide to grab her for themselves." He shook his head and folded the charts with a finality that ended the discussion. "I am taking her home myself." The first days were the hardest, not because of any external threat, but because Thessaly was broken in ways that could not be fixed with medicine or technology. She refused to leave the small cabin they had given her, refused to eat the rations they offered, and spent hours curled in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees. rocking back and forth while tears like liquid crystal rolled down her cheeks. Elias learned from the ship's damaged computers what had happened to her. Slavers had hit the royal convoy during a diplomatic mission, killing everyone aboard except the princess herself. She was too valuable to waste. A prize that could be sold to the Kreth hegemony for enough credits to buy a small moon. But the slavers had turned on each other, fighting over shares and plans until their greed destroyed them all, leaving Thessaly frozen in her pod while their corpses rotted around. 3 cycles she had been missing. 3 cycles her mother had mourned. 3 cycles the galaxy had assumed she was dead. Elias did not try to force her to recover. He had seen trauma before, had carried it himself, and he knew that pushing too hard would only make things worse. Instead, he learned her customs from the ship's cultural database, studying Velanti traditions with the same focus he brought to disarming explosives. He learned that Velanti did not eat cooked food, so he found ways to prepare raw nutrients in forms she could tolerate. He learned that they valued personal space above almost everything else, so he never entered her cabin without permission and never touched her without warning. He learned that they communicated much through silence and presence, so he began sitting outside her door for hours at a time, not speaking, just letting her know that someone was there. Slowly, painfully, Thessaly began to emerge. She started eating small amounts, then larger ones. She started watching him through the cracked door of her cabin, studying this strange pink creature who moved so carefully around her. She started making sounds that might have been words, testing her voice after so long in the frozen dark. The translation software on the Defiant Wake was old and imperfect, but it was enough to bridge the gap between them. Their conversations were simple at first, just names for things and basic concepts, but they grew more complex as the days passed, and Thessaly's confidence slowly returned. Why? She asked him one evening as the ship drifted through a quiet stretch of empty space. Why do you help me? Elias considered the question carefully before answering, because it is the right thing to do. Thessaly's fractured eyes studied him for a long moment, and he could see her struggling to understand. The Velanti operated on complex systems of debt and obligation, of favors given and owed, of political calculations that stretched across generations. The idea of helping someone simply because it was right made no sense in her framework. You want nothing? She pressed. I want you to get home safe, Elias said. That is enough. She did not believe him. He could see it in her face, but she did not argue. And that night she slept with her door slightly open for the first time since coming aboard. The pirate corridor came at them without warning one moment they were cruising through empty space. The next, they were surrounded by 6 fast attack ships bristling with weapons and broadcasting demands for surrender. Elias had dealt with pirates before, had talked his way out of some situations and fought his way out of others. But these were Varax raiders, the worst of the worst, known for taking prisoners only when they wanted entertainment. Stay in your cabin, he told Thessaly as he strapped on his combat gear. Lock the door and do not come out no matter what you hear. She grabbed his arm with 2 of her 4 hands, her grip surprisingly strong. They will kill you, maybe, he admitted, but they will not get to you. The raiders boarded through the cargo bay, 8 of them in scarred armor carrying weapons that could punch through hull plating. They expected easy prey, a merchant vessel crewed by soft humans who would beg for their lives. They were wrong. Elias met them in the narrow corridor, outside engineering, where their numbers meant nothing and their heavy weapons became liabilities. He moved through them like smoke and lightning, his pistol barking and his knife flashing, using the walls and ceiling and every dirty trick he had learned in 20 years of surviving the worst the galaxy had to offer. He took a plasma bolt to the shoulder, midway through the fight, the impact spinning him around and filling his vision with white-hot agony. But he did not stop, could not stop, because somewhere behind him was a scared, girl counting on him to keep her safe. When it was over, 8 raiders lay dead or dying on the deck, and Elias stood swaying in the middle of them with blood running down his arm and his breath coming in ragged. Gasps he did not know Thessaly had followed him until he heard her gasp. She stood at the end of the corridor, her fractured eyes wide with something that was not quite fear. She had watched the whole thing, had seen this soft-spoken human transform into something terrible and efficient. And Elias could see her entire understanding of his species shifting behind those alien eyes. "Your tutors told you humans were weak," he said through gritted teeth as he pressed a hand against his wound. "Did they not?" Thessaly did not answer, but she came to him and helped him to the medical bay, her forearms supporting him with a strength that surprised them both. And she cleaned his wound with hands that trembled only slightly. She spoke a word he did not recognize. "Cathalar," she said softly. The translation software struggled with it, offering fragments that made little sense. "Shield-bearer. Oath-keeper. One who stands without asking. What does that mean?" Elias asked. Thessaly looked at him for a long moment, her crystalline tears catching the light. "It means I was wrong about your kind," she whispered. "It means I will not be wrong again." From that day forward, she no longer flinched when he entered a room. She began taking meals with the crew, began learning their names and their stories, began asking questions about Earth and humanity and all the things she had been taught to dismiss. And when nightmares came for her in the dark hours of the ship's night cycle, Elias would hear her calling out and would sit outside her door, not entering, just speaking softly until her cries faded and sleep took her again. The Volanti border drew closer with every passing day, and Elias could feel the weight of what was coming settling onto his shoulders. He had saved her from slavers and pirates and the cold void itself, but he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The Volanti Dominion did not trust humans, and convincing them to except one bringing their princes home would take more than good intentions. It might take everything he had left to give. The Volanti border announced itself with a wall of warships that materialized out of nothing, their cloaking fields dropping in perfect unison to reveal a fleet that could have crushed the defiant wake 1,000 times over. Elias counted 30 vessels in the first wave alone, their crystalline hulls gleaming with an inner light that made them look like fallen stars arranged for war. Weapon systems locked onto his ship with a sound that resonated through the hull, a deep harmonic hum that every spacer learned to fear, and a view screen filled with the image of a Volanti admiral whose 4 arms were folded in what the cultural database identified as profound disgust. "Human vessel." The admiral's voice came through cold and sharp. "You have entered sovereign Volanti space. You will surrender your ship and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will result in immediate destruction. I am Commander Elias Vance of the salvage vessel Defiant Wake." Elias replied, keeping his voice steady despite the sweat running down his back. "I am carrying Princess Thessaly Virkith, recovered from a derelict cruiser in the Korath Nebula. I am returning her to her people." The silence that followed seemed to last forever when the Admiral spoke again. There was something new in his voice, not belief, but a cold and terrible fury. "You dare speak that name? You dare use our grief as a tool for whatever scheme you are running? The princess is dead, human. She has been dead for 3 cycles. Her tomb stands in the Garden of Ancestors, and her mother has worn mourning white since the day we lost her. She is alive." Elias insisted. "She is on my ship right now. She is scared, and she misses her home. Let me speak to someone who can verify her identity, and I will prove what I am saying." "You will prove nothing," the Admiral snarled. "You have obviously fabricated this story to gain access to our space. Perhaps to plant a bomb, perhaps to deliver an assassin disguised as our lost child. Surrender now, and your crew will be given quick deaths. Resist, and we will make your end last for days." Thessaly pushed forward to the communications panel, her fractured eyes blazing with a fire Elias had never seen in her before. "Let me talk to them," she demanded. "They will know my voice. They will know my face. They cannot deny what is right in front of them." But when she tried to activate the channel, nothing happened. Elias checked the settings and felt his heart sink. "They have blocked incoming transmissions from our ship," he said quietly. "Protocol forbids broadcasting a royal voice on frequencies shared with lesser species vessels. They cannot hear you without breaking their own laws." Thessaly made a sound that might have been a scream or a sob, her four hands clenching into fists. "Then what do we do?" "They will kill you. They will kill your crew. And then they will destroy whatever evidence might have proved I am real." Elias stared at the fleet surrounding them, at the weapons pointed at his ship, at the admiral, whose face showed nothing but contempt for the human who had dared to speak a sacred name. There was no way out through Force 100 ships, like the defiant wake could not have. Scratch the paint on even one of those warships, and there was no way out through words when the other side refused to listen. But there was one other option, something Elias had learned about during his long nights studying Volanti culture while Thessaly slept. "Admiral," he said slowly, "I invoke Valkyrith." The effect was immediate and electric. Every Volanti on the view screen froze, their expressions shifting from contempt to shock to something that looked almost like respect. The Admiral's four arms dropped to his sides, and for the first time, he looked at Elias as something other than vermin to be exterminated. "You know that term?" the Admiral asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it," Elias confirmed. "A challenge of honor. If I win, you escort me to your homeworld in peace and allow me to present the princess to her mother. If I lose, I die, and my crew goes free with their lives and their ship." "Those are the ancient terms, yes?" "Those are the terms," the Admiral agreed slowly. "But no human has ever invoked Valkyrith. No human has ever been worthy of the honor of dying in such a way. Why should I grant you this?" Elias met the Admiral's eyes through the view screen and let every ounce of conviction he possessed flow into his voice. "Because if there is even a chance that I am telling the truth, then your princess is on this ship. And if you destroy us without giving me the chance to prove it, you will be the one who killed her. You will carry that weight for the rest of your life, Admiral. Can you live with that possibility?" The Admiral was silent for a long moment, his crystalline features unreadable. Then he made a gesture that the database translated as acknowledgement with reluctance. "Very well, human. You will have your Valkyrith. Prepare yourself, my champion will not show mercy." The duel took place on the deck of the Admiral's flagship, a vast arena of polished crystal where generations of Volanti warriors had proven themselves in combat. Elias stood at one end in his battered combat gear, his wounds from the pirate fight still healing, and watched as his opponent emerged from the opposite side. The Volanti champion was everything Elias was not: 8 feet tall, covered in ceremonial armor that gleamed like liquid silver, with 4 arms that ended in hands large enough to crush a human skull like an egg. He moved with a grace that spoke of centuries of warrior tradition, of a species that had been perfecting the art of combat since humanity was still learning to make fire. The rules were simple: no weapons, no armor for the human since his gear would not match Volanti standards, and the fight would continue until one combatant could no longer rise. Elias stripped off his jacket and his shirt, revealing a torso covered in scars from a lifetime of violence. The watching Volanti murmured among themselves. They had expected human skin to be soft and unmarked. "Not this map of survival written in healed tissue. You have fought before," the champion observed, his voice deep and resonant. "I have done many things before," Elias replied. settling into a fighting stance. And I have survived all of them. The champion attacked with speed that should have been impossible for something so large, his forearms striking in combinations that no human could hope to match. Elias took the first blow across his ribs and felt something crack. Took the second across his face and tasted blood. Took the third and fourth and fifth because there was simply no way to block them all, but he did not fall, he rolled with the impacts. He redirected what force he could, and he struck back at every opening, quick jabs to joints and pressure points. Kicks to knees that buckled even Volanthi legs. Headbutts and elbow strikes and every brutal technique he had ever learned in every desperate fight of his life. The champion hit him again and again, breaking bones and splitting skin, driving him to the deck more times than either of them could count. And every time, Elias got back up. 15 minutes became 30. 30 became 45, and the watching Volanthi grew silent with something that might have been awe. They had expected the human to die quickly, to provide a few moments of entertainment before the inevitable end. But instead, they witnessed something they had no word for. Elias fought like pain was a suggestion rather than a command. He fought like his body was a tool to be used until it broke completely. He fought with a stubborn, spiteful refusal to accept defeat that transcended anything the Volanthi understood about combat. At the 47-minute mark, both fighters stood swaying in the center of the arena. The champion's silver armor was dented and cracked. His breathing labored, and one of his forearms hung limp at his side. Elias could barely see through the blood running into his eyes, could barely breathe through ribs that ground against each other with every movement. But he was still standing. Yield, the champion gasped. You cannot win. You must know this. Elias spat blood onto the crystal floor and raised his fists. I do not know how to yield. The champion struck one final time, a blow that should have ended everything. But Elias twisted at the last moment, took the impact on his shoulder instead of his head, and drove his elbow into the gap between the champion's neck and armor with every ounce of strength he had left. The champion felt arena went absolutely silent as the greatest warrior of the Volanthi fleet lay unconscious on the deck, defeated by a broken human who stood over him on legs that should not have been able to support his weight. Elias turned to face the admiral, blood dripping from his fingertips and agony screaming through every nerve. My escort, he said through teeth that no longer quite aligned properly. If you please. The admiral stared at him for a long moment, then slowly crossed two of his arms in the gesture of honor acknowledged. You will have your escort, human, he said quietly. And may the ancestors help us all understand what we have just witnessed. The fleet formed up around the defiant wake and began the journey to Volantho's prime. And in her cabin, Thessaly Verkith wept with joy and terror, and hope for the first time in 3 cycles home was finally within reach. Volanthos prime rose from the darkness of space like a jewel set against black velvet, its surface shimmering with cities of crystal and light that had stood for 10,000 years before humanity ever looked up at the stars. Elias watched from the bridge of the defiant wake as the planet grew larger in the viewscreen, his body wrapped in bandages and held together by painkillers and sheer determination. The fleet medical officers had wanted to sedate him for the journey, to let him heal in a proper medical bay, but he had refused. He had promised to bring Thessaly home, and he intended to be conscious when he fulfilled that promise. Thessaly stood beside him, her 4 hands clasped in front of her, and her fractured eyes fixed on the world she had thought she would never see again. She had not spoken much since the duel, but she had stayed close to Elias. And sometimes when she thought he was not looking, she would reach out and touch his arm, as if making sure he was still real. It looks smaller than I remember, she said softly as they entered the atmosphere. I used to think it was the largest thing in the universe. I used to believe nothing could ever happen that would take me away from it. Memory has a way of changing things. Elias replied, but the important parts stay the same. Your mother is down there. Your home is down there. Everything that matters is waiting for you. The landing pad was surrounded by crowds that stretched beyond the edge of visibility. Millions of Volanti who had gathered to witness something that should have been impossible. They had been told that their lost princess was returning, brought back from the dead by a human of all things. And none of them quite believed it until the defiant wake touched down and the boarding ramp began to lower. Elias went first, limping down the ramp into the golden light of the Volanti sun. The crowd fell silent at the sight of him, this battered, broken human wrapped in bandages and walking with the careful steps of someone holding himself together through will alone. They had expected a monster, a warrior giant, something that matched the stories already spreading about the Valkarath duel. But instead they saw a tired man with kind eyes who turned back toward the ship and extended his hand. Thessaly emerged from the shadow of the doorway, and the silence shattered into a sound that Elias would remember for the rest of his life. Millions of voices crying out in joy and disbelief, in prayer and thanksgiving, as their princess walked down the ramp with her crystalline skin catching the light and her row marks glowing bright enough to be seen from the back of the crowd. She took Elias's offered hand without hesitation, and together they walked through a corridor of weeping Volanthi toward the palace that rose in the distance like a mountain made of frozen starlight. The throne of light was the heart of the Volanthi dominion, a chamber so vast that clouds formed near its ceiling and so beautiful that even Elias, who had seen wonders across 100 worlds, had to stop and stare. Walls of living crystal sang with harmonics that resonated in the bones, and light streamed through windows that had been crafted by artisans dead for millennia. At the far end of the chamber, atop a dais of steps that seemed to climb forever, sat the Empress Verketh. She was taller than any Volanthi Elias had seen, her form draped in white mourning robes that had not been removed in 3 cycles. Her face was a mask of perfect composure, betraying nothing of the chaos that must have been raging behind those ancient eyes. She had buried her daughter in her heart, had built a tomb and spoken the words of farewell, and learned to live with an absence that could never be filled. And now her daughter stood at the base of her throne, alive and whole and reaching up toward her with trembling hands. The court advisors moved to intercept Elias, their expressions making clear that he had no place in this sacred moment. The human must leave, the senior advisor announced, his forearms spread in the gesture of absolute authority. Protocol demands that no alien witness the reunion of royal blood. He has done his part and will be rewarded appropriately, but he cannot remain. Thessaly turned to face the advisor, and something in her bearing shifted. She was no longer the frightened girl Elias had pulled from a stasis pod, no longer the traumatized victim who flinched at shadows. She was a princess of the blood, heir to an empire of trillions, and her voice carried the weight of generations when she spoke. He stays, or I do not walk forward, the advisor sputtered in outrage, looking to the Empress for support, but the Empress said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on her daughter, drinking in every detail of her face like a woman dying of thirst who had finally found water. This human, Thessaly continued, risked everything to bring me home. He asked for nothing in return. He fought your champion and nearly died rather than abandon me. He has earned the right to see this through to the end, and I will not take a single step toward that throne unless he is beside me. The silence that followed was absolute. No one in the history of the Dominion had ever made such a demand, had ever placed an alien on equal footing with royal family in a moment of sacred significance. The Empress raised one hand, and the advisor fell silent. Let him stay. 3 words, spoken in a voice like crystal bells, and the matter was settled. Elias felt the weight of those words like a physical force. The entire power of an ancient empire directed at this single moment of exception. He walked beside Thessaly as she crossed the vast chamber, matching his limping pace to her trembling steps. They climbed the stairs together, step by agonizing step. And with each one, he could see the composure cracking on the Empress's face. 10 steps from the top. Elias stopped. "The rest is yours," he said softly. "Go to her." Thessaly looked back at him with eyes that held more gratitude than any words could express. And then she turned and ran the final steps, throwing herself into her mother's arms with a cry that echoed through the chamber like a bell. "Mother," she whispered, loud enough for only the Empress and Elias to hear. "I am home, the Empress, ruler of trillions, leader of an empire that stretched across 1,000 worlds. The unbreakable monarch who had shown no emotion in public for 40 cycles, wrapped all 4 of her arms around her daughter and wept. The court watched in stunned silence as their Empress, their symbol of eternal strength and composure, sobbed into her daughter's hair like any other mother who had gotten back something precious that she thought was lost forever. They saw tears like liquid diamonds running down her crystalline cheeks, saw her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions she had held inside for 3 impossible years. Elias stood on the steps and watched, his own eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. He had seen many things in his life, had witnessed wonders and horrors in equal measure, but he had never seen anything as beautiful as this moment of reunion. He did not belong here. He knew that. He was a human, an outsider, a member of a species that the Volanti had dismissed and looked down upon for as long as the 2 peoples had known of each other. But he had been allowed to witness this, and he understood what an honor that was after a time that might have been minutes or hours. The Empress lifted her head and looked at Elias over her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but there was something new in them, something that looked almost like wonder. "Human," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "What is your name?" "Elias Vance, Your Majesty. Elias Vance," the Empress repeated, tasting the words like they were something precious. "You have given me back my child. You have undone the worst grief I have ever known. How can any reward I offer possibly match what you have done?" Elias bowed his head, the movement sending pain shooting through his broken ribs. Seeing her home was reward enough. "Your Majesty." The Empress studied him for a long moment, and then she did something that no one in the chamber had ever seen before. She smiled. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we have been wrong about humans for a very long time." Thessaly reached out and took her mother's hand, guiding the Empress's gaze back to her own face. "You were wrong," she confirmed, "but there is time to learn. There is time to understand. And it starts with him." She looked back at Elias, her fractured eyes shining with tears and joy and something that looked like the beginning of a new era. "It starts with Kethalar." The Empress summoned Elias to her private chambers 3 days after the reunion. After the celebrations had quieted and the crowds had dispersed and Volanthos Prime had begun to return to something resembling normal life, he came as he was still wrapped in bandages, still moving carefully to protect his healing ribs, because the Volanthi healers had offered to accelerate his recovery with their advanced technology, and he had politely refused. The pain reminded him that what he had done was real, and some part of him was not ready to let go of that reminder just yet. The Empress's private chambers were smaller than Elias had expected, warm and filled with personal items rather than the cold grandeur of the Throne of Light. There were images of Thessaly at various ages displayed on the walls, gifts from diplomats and visitors stacked carefully on shelves, and a single window that looked out over the capital city with its towers of crystal reaching toward the sky. "Please sit," the Empress said, gesturing to a chair that had clearly been brought in specifically for him, sized for a human frame rather than a Volanti's taller form. It was a small courtesy, but Elias understood the significance. She had thought about his comfort, had prepared for his visit, had treated him as a guest rather than a curiosity. "Your Majesty," he said as he settled into the chair. "You honor me. I honor the man who brought my daughter home," she replied, taking her own seat across from him. "That is not honor. That is basic decency, something I fear my people have forgotten when it comes to your kind." She paused, studying him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "I wish to offer you a reward, Elias Vance. I have considered many options, and I want you to know what is available to you before you make any decisions." She raised one hand and began counting on her fingers. "First, I can offer you wealth beyond anything your species has ever accumulated. Enough credits to buy a fleet, a station, perhaps even a small world. Second, I can offer you titles and land within the Dominion, making you the first human ever granted noble status in our empire. Third, I can offer you a commission in our fleet, with a ship and crew of your own, the finest technology our civilization has to offer." She lowered her hand and met his eyes directly. "Or I can offer you something else entirely, if none of these appeal. Name your price, and if it is within my power to grant, it is yours." Elias sat in silence for a long moment, considering the weight of what she was offering. He had lived his entire life scraping for survival, fighting for every meal and every tank of fuel, never knowing if tomorrow would bring fortune or disaster. A single word from him could change all of that, could transform him into one of the wealthiest and most powerful beings in the galaxy. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "I appreciate the offer, truly I do. But I did not bring Thessaly home for a reward. I brought her home because she was someone's daughter, because she was scared and alone and needed help. I would have done the same thing if she had been a commoner's child. Or if there had been no reward at all." The Empress tilted her head, her crystalline features showing something that might have been confusion. "Then what do you want?" Surely there must be something. Elias thought about his ship, about his crew, about the endless stretches of space that had been his home for 20 years. He thought about the pirates and the corporate wars and the hostile borders that made every journey a gamble with death. "I want things to be a little bit better," he said slowly. "Not for me specifically, but for everyone. I want the next human who finds themselves in Volanti space to have a chance of being heard before being shot. I want people to know that maybe we are not so different after all, your kind and mine. I want one act of kindness to mean something beyond just this moment." The Empress was silent for a long time, her ancient eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his soul. "You know," she said at last, "the word Thessaly used to describe Ukef Aller and has only been used once before in our entire history. It was given to a general named Varthan, who carried a dying emperor across a battlefield for 6 days without stopping, refusing to let his leader die alone in the mud. He asked for no reward either. He said that serving with honor was enough." She rose from her seat and moved to the window, looking out over her city. "I always thought that story was exaggerated, a legend inflated by time and retelling. Now I wonder if perhaps it was understated instead." She turned back to face him. "You cannot ask for rewards that benefit everyone and expect me to count them as favors to you personally. That is not how this works. But I will grant what you have asked, and I will add something of my own." Elias waited, unsure what she intended. "From this day forward," the Empress announced, "there will be a corridor through Volanti space where human ships may travel freely, protected by our laws and defended by our fleet. It will be called the Vance Passage, and any human who uses it will know that it exists because one of their own proved that kindness transcends the boundaries between species." Elias opened his mouth to protest, to say that he did not need his name attached to anything. But the Empress raised a hand to silence him. "This is not negotiable," she said firmly. "You have given my people a gift, the gift of seeing humanity as something other than a threat or a nuisance. The least I can do is ensure they remember who taught them that lesson." There was a soft knock at the door, and Thessaly entered without waiting for permission. She had changed in the days since their arrival, her bearing more confident and her movements more assured. And she carried something wrapped in cloth that glowed faintly through the fabric. "I hoped I would find you here," she said to Elias, crossing the room to stand before him. "I wanted to give you this before you left." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a shard of crystal that pulsed with inner light, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to shift and move like living things. Elias recognized it immediately. It was a piece of a royal crest, the sacred symbol of the Verketh bloodline that was given only to family members and the closest of allies. "Thessaly," the Empress said sharply, "do you understand what you are doing?" "I understand perfectly, Mother," Thessaly replied without looking away from Elias. "I am giving a piece of myself to someone who has already proven he would give all of himself for me. In Volanthi tradition, this makes him kin, not a subject, not an ally, but family. And I would not have it any other way." She pressed the crystal into Elias's hands, and he felt warmth spread through his fingers, through his arms, through his entire body. It was as if the crystal recognized him, accepted him, welcomed him into something larger than himself. "You saved me," Thessaly said softly. "Not just my life, but my faith in others, my belief that the universe can be kind. I was alone in the dark for so long, and you brought me back into the light. How could I ever repay that?" Elias looked down at the crystal in his hands, feeling its gentle pulse like a second heartbeat against his palms. "You do not need to repay anything," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I will treasure this for as long as I live." Thessaly smiled, a real smile, the first one Elias had seen from her that held no shadow of pain or fear. "Will you come back?" she asked. "To visit, I mean. You will always have a place here, always have family waiting for you. Will you return?" Elias thought about his ship, about his crew who were probably growing restless after so many days of inactivity, about the endless stars that called to him with promises of adventure and danger and life lived on the edge. "If you ever need me," he said, "I will be here." That is a promise. He left Volanthos Prime the next morning, walking up the ramp of the Defiant Wake while crowds of Volanthi watched in silence. Some of them bowed as he passed, a gesture of respect that no human had ever received from their kind. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the legends that had already begun to spread with the ordinary-looking man who was the source of the malice. The ship lifted off and broke through the atmosphere. Elias looked back at the jeweled world falling away behind him. Somewhere down there, a princess was finally home. An empress was learning that her prejudices had been wrong. And an empire was beginning to reconsider everything it thought it knew about humanity. Word spread quickly across the galaxy. The xenophobic Volanthi had opened their borders to human ships, had named a passage after a human commander, had accepted a human into their royal family. Other species took notice, began to wonder what it was about these strange, fragile, stubborn creatures that could inspire such change, and in the quiet stretches between stars. Other humans heard the story and felt something stir in their hearts, pride, perhaps, or hope. Or simply the reminder that one person doing the right thing could matter more than all the fleets and weapons in the universe. Elias settled into his captain's chair and set course for the unknown. The crystal shard warm against his chest, where he wore it next to his heart. Behind him, an empire changed ahead of him. The stars waited, and somewhere in between, a young princess smiled as she watched his ship disappear into the void, knowing that she would see her Kethalar again,